So now that you've all gotten your cookies and had your afternoon snack, I'm going to talk about poop. But my name is Michelle Barbieri, and I am a wildlife veterinarian. I focus most of my time on these guys, Hawaiian monk seals, and I work for NOAA. I specifically work for the Hawaiian monk seal research program that's part of the Science Center. And so home base for me is at Fort Island in Pearl Harbor. Okay, as the title says, we're going to talk about infections in Hawaiian monk seals with something that's got a lot of letters. And the way you say that is Toxoplasma gondii. So we were just talking a few minutes ago about how you pronounce it. And you'll hear me say it a lot. So by the end of today, you'll probably be saying it yourself. What are we going to talk about today? To get started, I'm going to introduce Toxoplasma gondii. Then I'm going to talk you through the life cycle of this parasite. And the reason I'm going to talk you through the life cycle of the parasite is because it has a lot of important implications for how we understand these infections in monk seals and what we might be looking towards for solutions. About the consequences of infections with Toxoplasma, about some of the solutions that we might be able to use to take care of this problem. So what is it? If you're paying attention, the answer to this question is in the title of the presentation. And the reason I'm making sure that I call that out here is because it's a really important distinction. And so I want to make sure everyone understands what we're dealing with. So is it a parasite, a bacteria, a virus, or a fungus? Because all of these things can cause infections, but Toxoplasma is only one of those. What do you guys think? Yeah, it's a parasite. So that's what's shown in the picture here on the right-hand side. And there's actually multiple eggs of Toxoplasma. So those circles in the center of that are what you would see under the microscope. Looking at the eggs, this is an oocyst, but I'm going to say egg today. If I slip by accident and say oocyst, that oo in front of the word means egg. But we're talking about eggs, and that's what they look like. So they're tiny little microscopic things you can't see with the naked eye. Infections with Toxoplasma gondii are widespread. So basically any warm-blooded animal can get these infections. Infections can cause a very wide range of things. So that can go from no ill effects all the way to mortality, death. Of these animals that are infected, including people, have no ill effects. They never know they're infected. And I'm going to give you a couple of statistics later on about these infections in people. A lot of people are infected, but very few actually realize that. Yeah?
You showed the egg, but would you say where in the body is it mostly in the blood or other places?
Thank you for asking that question. I hope I will answer that for you as I go on, but if I don't, raise your hand again and let me know. So in between this spectrum of no ill effects from the info way to death, there are a lot of things that can happen in between there too. Sometimes infections can be delayed. So there's a lag time between when someone might acquire the infection and first get exposed and when they would actually be sick. That could be whether it's an animal or a person. Sometimes they can cause brain disease, brain dysfunction in people that manifests itself as mental illness. There's actually been some scientific research that has been showing that people that are infected may be more likely to be risk takers, to die in car accidents, may develop schizophrenia. So there's some really interesting things about that aspect of the infection. It can cause abortions or stillbirths. In people, we call this miscarriages most of the time. Or if the fetus makes it all the way to birth, it can result in birth defects. Generally, we think of these things as being caused by infections that are acquired by a pregnant mom during the time that she's pregnant. Later on, in monk seals in particular, and in some of the other species that are infected with Toxoplasma, they can have liver failure, heart failure, and ultimately full body failure of multiple organs from severe disease. And that generally does lead to death. One terminology point that I want to make here is the difference between Toxoplasma gondii, which is the name of the parasite, and this other word at the bottom of the screen, Toxoplasmosis. So Toxoplasmosis is a word that means the state of having disease or the state of being sick from an infection with Toxoplasma gondii. So if you hear those two terms, whether it's today in the talk or out and about talking with other folks, what causes the disease is Toxoplasma. Anything that is sick with that infection has Toxoplasmosis. All right, so let's get into this life cycle. How does it infect? I said there's a lot of animals out there that are infected with Toxoplasma, but we're gonna start with a really essential one, and that is the cat. The cat is important because it is playing a direct role in the life cycle of Toxoplasma. So it's unique compared to all the other animals that we might talk about. And I should say here also that here in Hawaii, the only felids we have are cats. If we were, say, giving this talk in California, other cats that could allow the replication of this parasite and the persistence of this parasite could be other cat species. So maybe a bobcat or a mountain lion or something like that. So it is very specific to felids, felids being that general name for all those kinds of cats. But here in Hawaii, the only one of those we have is the cat that everyone's very familiar with. Here are the two main players. The cat is what we call the definitive host. So the cat is required for the parasite to reproduce sexually and to persist in the environment and to continue to exist as a parasite. On the right, we have our Toxoplasma eggs, just as I showed you before. Like any good parasite, Toxoplasma does not kill the cat, and generally cats have absolutely no idea that they're infected. They don't know when they're getting infected. They don't know when they're excreting the eggs. They have no idea what's going on. They're just, the key part of this without their knowledge. Toxoplasma, again, requires this definitive host, the cat, in order to sexually reproduce and spread. And the way that it is spread is in the feces. So I hope that gets to your question front row from earlier. So the way that these eggs are disseminated is in the feces. And that's really, really important. So keep that in mind. So what Toxoplasma wants to do after it's excreted in the feces from a cat is get back into another cat. That is its entire goal, is to get into the gastrointestinal system of another cat. So it wants to get into their stomach, into their intestines, because basically that's where it can have sex. So that's what the parasite's trying to do. Generally, the way that that could happen is that a cat might encounter the eggs in the environment and accidentally swallow them. The eggs are really long-lived. They're really strong. They're robust. They can exist in the soil, in fresh water, in salt water for months, even years. These eggs can actually survive in sulfuric acid. So they're really strong things. So they persist in the environment way longer after the cat poop has degraded and gone away. So a cat could plausibly encounter these eggs out in the course of its duties. Maybe it eats something that had some poop on it or had some eggs on it or something like that. And then the parasite is really excited. It's back in the gut of another cat to basically sexually reproduce and get shed in the feces of another cat. And that's how it spreads. But this parasite is even smarter than what that sounds like. So for a moment, let's just look at our two players and think about what else this might do to get into the stomach of a cat. It takes advantage of the cat's prey. And that is really, really important for us to know, because once I get through this life cycle, I'm going to explain to you how this step in the life cycle is how monk seals are getting affected too. Further, I want to go back for a second and talk about these eggs that are shed in the feces of cats. And I'm saying shedding, and that's just a biology term meaning defecating or releasing in the feces. So we're not shedding hair of the cats. The eggs aren't coming out in their hair. It's just a term that means they're pooping them out. As we've established, Toxoplasma wants to be inside the gut of the cat. It reproduces there. After that point, it makes millions to billions of eggs, which are excreted in the feces or shed in the feces of that cat. Generally, cats are known to shed these eggs in their feces for a period of 1 to 2 weeks after they get infected. Thereafter, they tend not to shed the eggs any longer. The scientific literature about if they get re-exposed at some later point in their life, to what degree they will shed these eggs again. It's generally thought now that they will shed a second time if they're exposed. We're talking about a lot of eggs being defecated by a cat that's newly infected in a very short period of time. Couple that with the fact that one egg alone with infection, we're talking about a pretty successful parasite. And we know that they live for a long time, these eggs, long after the feces have decomposed. So let's go back to our three players now. So we have intermediate hosts. So these are non-coincidentally part of the cat's food chain. So we have things like birds and rodents that cats are going to be out preying upon. What happens if one of these eggs gets encountered by a bird as it's rooting in the dirt and picking out some insects, or a rodent who's, picking them up and is a lot closer to ground level than, say, a cat would be? Once they get inside the stomach of one of these other intermediate hosts, they actually can't reproduce the way that they would inside a cat. Intestinal tract, and they move into the tissues. They go to places like the muscle and the brain, which are two high energy tissues that a cat is likely to eat when it kills one of these prey items. Because again, the main goal of this parasite is to what? Get back into the gut of a cat. So it's really clever. Instead of just waiting around for another cat to pick it up, it's actually going to take advantage of the cat's food chain. Tissue cysts are what form in these other things, these intermediate hosts, the cat prey, the birds, the rodents, etc. Of what they look like in tissues. So on the left is brain tissue, and on the right is heart tissue. And let's see, I remember. Yeah. So this is brain tissue here, and this is muscle. So these are muscle cells. Circles in the center of each of these images are tissue cysts of Toxoplasma. So it essentially goes undercover in these other species, and it takes this different life stage. A tissue cyst, just right there. So they form these tissue cysts, they go undercover. More often than not, these animals don't know they're infected either. And they just keep doing their thing and wait. The organism is waiting until they get eaten by a cat. And once these tissue cysts, which are full of tiny little organisms of Toxoplasma, get back into the gut of a cat, then they can complete their life cycle. But then they can reproduce, they can create billions of eggs, and they can get shed in the feces of the next cat. So here are some lines connecting all of these dots for you to kind of get the big picture of what this whole life cycle looks like. And with the cat, the parasite sexually reproduces in their gut, creates millions to billions of eggs, which are shed, excreted in the feces. So, yeah.
When the cat eats the muscle tissue or the heart tissue,
Mm-hmm.
what triggers the reproduction cycle of
Of Toxo? It's simply a matter of being in a cat. Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly. And it's really important to hit that home, because that is a key point, that the organism in the stomach of any other species is not going to replicate in this way. So the only way that eggs can be produced by the parasite is to be in the gut of a cat. So after the bird or the rodent perhaps encounters these eggs, again, they're going to develop those tissue cysts that are in the left-hand side of the screen. And they're going to wait until they get eaten by a cat. Once they do, then the life cycle continues. All right. Now, is everybody with me? Because I'm going to mix this up a little bit. Okay. Okay. One more side note before I mix it up. Okay, so let's think about the fecal material of cats that are put into the environment and the basically environmental contamination. And this is starting to touch on why we have a problem. The statistics that are available are United States, so we don't have this information for Hawaii. But annually, it's estimated that 1.2 million of cat feces are deposited in the United States, and that's every year. As we've talked about, the cats that are outside are putting a whole lot of eggs into their feces in a short period of time. So those two things combined mean that depending on the density of the cats that are in the environment, you can have anywhere from an average of 3 to more than 400 eggs per square foot of the environment. That's a lot of contamination. You add what we've established as these eggs are sturdy, they're robust in the environment, they hang out for months to years in the soil, in salt water, in fresh water. And reminder, it only takes one egg to transmit infection. So keep that in mind as we continue. And we're going to mix up this life cycle. Instead of the cat prey encountering those eggs in the environment, let's say something else does. What in Hawaii, for example, that might root around in the soil? It's a lot bigger than a bird or a mouse. Pig. So I'm going to use pig as an example. So let's say the pig is exposed to the eggs. Well, the parasite doesn't know that it's in a pig versus a mouse versus a bird or whatever. It's going to do the same thing. So it's going to break out of their gut and it's going to go form those tissue cysts in the muscle and the brain, those purple dots. And what's interesting about this is that cats are not going to go prey upon pigs. So there's really not much of an option for anywhere else for this parasite to go. It's essentially a dead end. The only way that the pig can share the infection with anything else is if, say, perhaps a person shoots that pig, is out hunting, and doesn't cook the pork well enough. If that's the case, then the person can also develop a tissue cyst in its brain or in its muscle. So this is one of the most common ways that people get infected with Toxoplasma, is from eating it from their food and it not being cooked properly to kill the parasite. Another way that people can get exposed is directly from contact with those infectious eggs. So any of you that have had children may remember that your doctor asked if you had a cat. You may have even been tested for Toxoplasma in your blood when you were pregnant. The reason that you are advised to stay away from the litter box is exactly this reason. So the interesting thing about these is that they touch on how monk seals could also be getting exposed. So instead of it being a pig or a person, it could be a seal, it could be a dolphin, it could be an otter, it could be any other mammal out there that may be exposed, and they're going to develop a tissue cyst. Quick segue, and use this opportunity to talk just a little bit about Toxoplasmosis and people, because I think since I brought up humans a couple of times, I wanted to share that I was going to come back to a couple of statistics. So here they are from the CDC. Toxoplasmosis, meaning the state of having disease from Toxoplasma, is a leading cause of death from foodborne illness in the United States. So it is a threat to human health, and it generally is from the food that people are eating. More than 60 million people in the United States carry this parasite. So a whole lot of us have been exposed. A lot of the people in this room probably have. As a veterinarian, I'm sure I probably have. But very few have symptoms. So as I said earlier in the talk, we have that whole spectrum of effects from this disease. Generally, it doesn't result in disease. But among people, women that are newly infected during pregnancy, and anyone with a compromised immune system, say someone receiving chemotherapy, for example, should be aware that toxoplasmosis can definitely have some consequences for his or her health. Okay, so people, pigs, and other animals actually have a name to describe them. So we said that the cats are the definitive host. The mice, the prey of cats, are the intermediate host. These guys are called incidental hosts. And that's where all of these other animals come into play. So they're all incidental hosts, meaning that they either ingest the eggs or ingest the tissue cysts and acquire the infection incidentally, just like the word sounds. It's not a natural part of the life cycle. Toxoplasma wants to get back into a cat. So similar to those intermediate hosts, the cat prey, these incidental hosts may also develop tissue cysts. The tissue cysts can pop up in people, can pop up in any of these animals. And if eaten by another animal that has tissue cysts, then the animal that ate it could also get tissue cysts to form. But the key thing that they all have in common is that none of them are cat prey. So what does that mean? It means that they're not going to complete the life cycle. And here's the big, big take home. They're not going to create eggs and shed them into the environment. So none of the incidental hosts that can get infected with Toxoplasma can poop. So that's a really, really important point. And it's a point that I think a lot of times people get confused about. So I want to make sure that I drive that home. And essentially from the parasite's perspective, if it gets into any of these incidental hosts, sure, it can do transmission from an individual animal to an individual animal. It is a dead end for the parasite, effectively. It's not going to be able to get back into the stomach of a cat and allow that sexual reproduction to take place. So I want to pause briefly here and say one other thing, because I have been asked this question a few times, so I want to make sure that I address it. Well, say a person maybe shot a pig, and the pig got away before it died, so you didn't actually retrieve the dead pig from the environment because you couldn't find it, ran away, whatever. The pig decomposes in the dirt. Can those tissue cysts last for months and years and everything just like the eggs did and contaminate the environment? The answer is no. They're going to decompose with the rest of the animal's tissues. So these purple tissue cysts in the meat contribute to environmental contamination the way that the eggs would. They're not the same life stage, so they don't have that protective outer coating to protect them from the environment. All right, we're going to move on to now talk a little bit about the consequences of infections. So we understand how infections can happen. There's two main ways. You can either consume the eggs or consume the prey or the other organism that has a tissue cyst. And now we're going to talk about what that means in some of these other animals that are completely peripheral to the life cycle and the overall intent of this parasite. Unfortunately, some of these infections, when they get into these incidental hosts, can lead to disease. As we said, that's called Toxoplasmosis. And unfortunately, in some of those cases, it also leads to death. This is where monk seals are coming into play. So now we're going to something that is specific to the feces of cats and really only wants to hang out in cats, actually can affect our native Hawaiian wildlife. And this is the first seal that I'm going to talk about today. This is a seal named RB24. This was an adult female. We encountered her sick in March of 2015 on Oahu over in Ko'olina. The symptoms, so to speak, that she was displaying that were unusual was that she was avoiding hauling out on the beach, floating and drifting with the currents for quite a period of time. She also aborted a fetus. And unfortunately, she succumbed to toxoplasmosis herself a few days after she aborted her fetus. We tried to rescue her. We finally had the ability to, this is a picture on the left of our team using some aluminum fence panels to coerce her slowly towards the beach so that we could put her in a cage and transport her to our facility. Once we got her on land, and even more so once we got her back to our rehab facility at Ford Island, we noticed that she really didn't want to move. She could move all of her flippers, she could move her head, she could turn her neck side to side, everything was movable, so she wasn't injured. But we were scratching our heads trying to figure out what is going on in this seal that makes her not want to move, so reluctant to move, in fact, that all these people standing around her were not enough of a stimulus for her to try to move away. And maybe sometimes we might like to think that seals know when we're trying to help them, but they're wild animals, and that's really not the case. So this seal, a wild animal just pulled out from her natural environment, should have had enough energy and interest, if she was healthy, to try to move away from us. And that was definitely not what was happening. After she died, we did a full examination of the body, and that's called a necropsy, or in other words, an animal autopsy. And we saw in her body that the blubber, the muscle, were riddled with organisms. She had the body inflammatory response causing an extraordinary amount of pain. And the fact that her blubber and muscle were so infected with Toxoplasma actually, to us, helped us connect all of these dots and really understand, first of all, why was she reluctant to move? Because it hurt that bad to move. Why did she not want to haul out on the beach? Because buoyancy was supporting her from all of that pain, from feeling her weight against the force of gravity. So this was a really unfortunate case, and this is the first of several cases. Well, this is the first of two cases that came to us still alive. Unfortunately, the vast majority of cases of toxoplasmosis in monk seals are dead before we have any opportunity to intervene. So what does toxoplasmosis look like in monk seals? As we learned from RB24, it means a rapid and painful decline. So by the time we brought her into our care, she was so sick, so compromised, her organs were failing, that she didn't last more than a few days. And she, as I said, aborted. So this is one of the unfortunate consequences of this infection in monk seals. It can cause brain or heart dysfunction in the species as well. As we talked about with RB24, she had extreme pain from just massive inflammation of the blubber and muscle in response to all the parasites that were rapidly multiplying and coursing through her tissues. And that manifests itself as difficulty breathing. And in fact, we believe that the reason that RB24 aborted her fetus several days before she died is because her lung disease was so severe that she wasn't able to get enough oxygen to her fetus. So the fetus didn't have toxoplasmosis itself. The fetus was aborted because it was under-oxygenated, because mom's lungs were so compromised. We've seen hepatitis or liver disease from this in monk seals. And in the animals that have come to us alive, those 2 cases, it has led to multiple organ failure. When they get to us, they're so sick, it progresses so rapidly that their entire organs, all the organs in their body are failing, and it leads to mortality. This is a picture that I'm going to try to walk you through to help you understand what I'm talking about when I'm saying that it's an inflammatory response in the body, and help you understand how that connects with the parasite and the animal overall to lead to death. So bear with me, because I know that this just looked like a lot of pink and purple dots, but I'm going to walk you through it. So here, the pink stuff, those big pink cells, those are muscle cells, and specifically muscle cells of the heart. The heart is just another type of muscle that's specialized. So we're looking at a microscopic, tiny little piece of the heart, very, very thinly sectioned, stained, and put on a microscope slide. And so we're looking at heart cells. And if this was a normal heart, that should be all you see, are those pink, a little bit of a border around them. So Toxoplasma is the organism that's next to some of those pink heart cells. And on top of that, we have inflammation. So this is what inflammation looks like, or microscopic level. So all these purple dots that are around this slide, these are all abnormal. And those are all inflammatory cells. And that's the body's natural response to an infection. You can kind of think of it as like there's a foreign intruder, and the body just sends these cells in to attack it. And the intruder is this guy, Toxoplasma. So it's creating this massive influx of cells that are trying to target that organism, that are trying to repair damaged cells by the organism. And unfortunately, in this heart tissue, they're losing the battle because these white cells are destroyed heart cells. So they're basically empty spaces where there used to be heart cells, and they've evaporated because the body is losing the battle. So when we say that we have seals that have died from toxoplasmosis, what we're talking about are seals where we've seen slides like these of their internal organs, their blubber and their muscle, where we can see the Toxoplasma organism directly associated with the cell and the body's response to the parasite and that losing battle. How we know that it's contributing to the death directly in these seals. So at this point in time, we know that at least 8 Hawaiian monk seals have died from toxoplasmosis, and this is a list of those individuals. By coincidence, we just had a paper come out on Monday of last week in a scientific journal called Diseases of Aquatic Organisms. So that's what's at the bottom of the slide here, and that talks about these mortalities. So if anyone's interested in that, let me know. My email address is on the last slide, so you can jot that down and shoot me an email if you'd like me to send you a copy of this. I totally meant to bring some along and forgot. So yeah, question.
Previous slide.
Previous slide. Yes.
The inflammatory cells. Those what cells that are coming to fight this, or some other kind of how are they generated?
Yeah, both. They're coming from the blood. They leave the bloodstream and they move into the tissues.
You know which type of blood cells?
There's a lot of different kinds of blood cells, and it depends on how long the infection's been going on before they move into the tissue. And then there are other cells from other places that can pop in as well. Yeah. All right, so we say at least 8 monk seals have died. Why are we saying at least? because more seals die every year than are found dead in general. So there are seals that we know that hang out in certain areas that are seen somewhat regularly, and unfortunately, several seals every year disappear. We don't always find a carcass. It may be because they hang out in areas sometimes where there aren't very many people to help us find them. It may be that they die when they're at sea. I mean, monk seals can move very, very long distances in the ocean. And so it's possible that rapidly progressing disease that they don't want to haul out, so they're not showing up in places where we can see them. And we don't end up having a carcass to study and look at in the same way that we have for these others. Furthermore, when we lose a female from the population, we didn't just lose one seal. We lost her entire future reproductive output. We lost all the female seals that she might have had, and those female seals, all the female seals that they might have had. So we've lost hers, her kids, her grandparents, her grandkids, her great-grandkids, and so on. So the loss of one female is a big deal. And roughly half of the seals that have died from toxoplasmosis so far have been female. So we're not just talking about 8 monk seals, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot right off the bat, but we're actually seeing that the population impacts to these mortalities are much greater. So what we have from toxoplasmosis is a new and growing threat to this vulnerable population. It is supported by decades of health monitoring in these seals. So what's also important for you guys to take away from this today is we didn't just decide that we were interested in Toxoplasma a few years ago and start looking for it. The program has been studying these, and those pink and purple slides that I showed you with all those pink and purple dots a few slides ago, that is something called histopathology. And every single time a seal dies, tissues are collected as long as they're in suitable condition. And this process happens with every single one of those animals. So their organs are all looked through. And this has been going on again for decades. So it's supported by decades of health monitoring means that we didn't just start looking for this yesterday. And the fact that all of the deaths that we have on record have occurred since 2000 means it's kind of a recent problem. Furthermore, we have an increasing seal population here in the main Hawaiian Islands in the same area where we have a lot of cats. So the fact that all these deaths have occurred since 2000 and the fact that we have more seals hanging out in areas where there's lots of cats means that we're probably just seeing the tip of the iceberg at this point in time.
Can't you catch the cats?
Perhaps. Bottom line, toxoplasmosis is a major threat to the recovery of monk seals. And it's not just monk seals. There are other wildlife in Hawaii that are affected by this. And so it is something that threatens not just the recovery of this endangered species, but several others as well. Yep.
In Hawaii, do we just have to throw cats in the main islands, or do you have in the local islands?
In the main islands.
But at local islands, where most of the seals are?
There are lots of seals out there, but there aren't cats. At least not at this point in the game. Yeah.
Why can't they be caught? They almost said catch them and go.
Yeah. Yep. There's a few more things, and I'll touch on that at the end for sure. All right. So I'm gonna contrast these 8 seals with toxoplasmosis to a seal on the right, which is an X-ray of the throat of a seal that has a fish hook. Can you guys see that fish hook? That circle hook right there? Okay, so those of you that are around and hear about seals that have been hooked in the main islands, it happens several times a year. So you may hear about it in the news. We are usually able to detect when seals are hooked. They have a big fleshy hook hanging out of their lip, or they have monofilament line coming out of their mouth. And there are some really astute volunteers around these islands that help us detect those things because they're out looking at the seals, they're performing outreach, and they see the seals often. So they know when something's not right, and they're really good at finding things like monofilament line coming out of the mouth of a seal. So first big difference, a seal that's ingested a fish hook generally ingested a fish hook. A seal that's sick with toxoplasmosis, generally, there's no obvious thing that clues us into, hey, the seal's sick. Secondly, we've been able to pull hooks out of a lot of seals. We're not 100% successful, but we're successful a lot of the time. So we can take these animals to surgery. We can pull hooks out the mouth under anesthesia. We can restrain seals out on the beach if it's safe, and we can pull those hooks out of their lips. So we have a lot of options for dehooking a seal that's ingested a hook after it alerts us to its presence. In contrast, as I said before, of those 8 seals that have died so far, 6 of those 8 were dead before we even knew something was going on. They were just found dead. And the 2 that we did bring into care died within just a very short period of time. So we don't actually have mitigation efforts that are really good for dealing with this threat, at least from the monk seal side of things, right? And that's what we are. We are monk seal biologists, health professionals. We deal with the monk seal side of things. And so we try really, really hard to mitigate threats where we can. But this is one that's really proving to be a challenge. So let's think about that in a little bit more detail. The treatment of monk seals, the ideal versus the reality. So first of all, we have to find a seal that's sick out in the wild with toxoplasmosis. As I said a minute ago, there's no obvious sign that's cluing us in to that fact. So generally speaking, they're found dead. So if we want to find a seal often than not, it's too late. But say, hypothetically, we get lucky and we identify a seal that's sick, and we bring it into our care and we start doing some diagnostics to try to figure out what's going on. Generally, the seal dies before we know it has toxoplasmosis. And that is because we have a 2-week lag time before we can get a definitive diagnosis. And that's because in order to diagnose this disease, you have to have blood that is from your initial time point and 2 weeks later. And you're looking at antibody changes in their blood. And so if their antibody titers are increasing and they're having more antibodies in their blood over that 2-week period of time, then you can say this is a new infection. If we just get that first time point and it's a really high test result, we're generally thinking that we have going on, but that still takes several days. It may not be 2 weeks before we get that initial result or that preliminary result, but it's still, by the time we ship samples to the mainland and can get those test results back, unfortunately, it's very likely that the seal is going to die. Because as we said again, this is a rapidly progressing disease in these animals. Yeah?
Could you take a biopsy of the tissue and, you know, the histology of it, look at it?
We could absolutely take a biopsy, and histology is another potential way to diagnose it. We still don't have that in-house capacity, so it still has to get sent out, and those things generally take weeks. So those slides that we get back on seals that die, generally we don't get them back for somewhere between 1 and 3 months. Yeah. So, yep, another question?
What's wrong with treating the symptoms rather than finding what really happens?
Well, good question, and you just segued into number 3. So, say we find a seal that's in the wild and it's sick. We bring it into our care and we make a preliminary diagnosis that we feel pretty confident about, and we get lucky enough to get past those 2 first stages. Then, hey, we're just going to pull the drugs off the shelf and start treating it, right? According to protocols and existing drugs. They don't exist. And we're working with an endangered species. So testing things out, maybe that would be a drug that could be used in horses for something that's not for toxo, but somewhat tangentially related to toxo, seems like a reasonable thing to do. But to experiment with testing out some drugs that we don't know work in any seal species on an endangered species, when you don't actually have 100% certainty that that's what your seal has, there's ground. So it doesn't mean that we aren't willing to try, and it means that we are thinking in that direction. But the most important thing is that we are building this on very unstable ground. So we're just not able to make very convincing decisions about any of these steps before we would even jump to a treatment possibility. And even at that point in time, we just don't have a sure shot treatment. So we can give them pain meds to see if that will help them feel better. We can give them other things to try to control the inflammation. But really what we've seen is that this is such a rapid progression of disease that what we would generally in veterinary medicine call supportive care, by giving them fluids and keeping them hydrated and giving them pain meds, etc., it's probably not going to prevent them from dying. Because what we really need to do is kill the parasites that are rapidly multiplying in their body.
I assume this infects other kinds of seals and sea lions in the world.
Mm-hmm. It does.
Have a big database of what works on those.
Unfortunately, as I said, they're found dead. So we're very fortunate in Hawaii, where we have a relatively small population of seals that are easily monitored. compared to a lot of other species. For example, let's say elephant seals in California. There are tons of elephant seals around. They're not exactly. Yeah, well, there are a lot of seals around other parts of the world, and they don't get the same type of close monitoring that monk seals get. It's not even feasible for hundreds of thousands of animals on coastlines that are often remote and that sort of thing. So generally speaking, it is what we call post-mortem diagnosis. It means that carcasses are recovered and tested. Like I said, they do those and make the diagnoses that way. Yep.
First of all, is it okay to interrupt you?
Yeah, yeah.
Just want to make sure. Okay, this is not going to sound real good, but I suppose there are some marine mammals in the world where we have so many of them that we could take a few and infect them with Toxoplasma and then test out likely drugs that, we're not going to just throw everything at them,
Yes.
Is that okay?
No.
They're all protected by NOAA and
They're all protected. All marine mammals, whether they're endangered or threatened or doing fine as population statuses go, they're all protected. And in the United States, especially, but in many countries, the general ethical opinion is that type of experimental research is not welcome. Yeah. All right, those were good questions, you guys. Thank you. So, lastly, say maybe we can't treat this disease, but have you guys heard that we're vaccinating monk seals now? We're vaccinating seals in the wild against a virus called morbillivirus. So some folks have asked, well, if you can vaccinate a seal against one thing, can you vaccinate it against this? Unfortunately, there is also no vaccine available. Not only is there not a vaccine available for the seals to prevent them from getting disease, there's not even a vaccine to prevent this from happening in cats in the first place, which would be ideal, but that definitely does not exist. So the bottom line is, as I said before, it doesn't mean that the next seal we get that comes in that we think might have toxoplasmosis, we aren't potentially going to try some new treatments. Really, this is not the strategy to approach this problem from the monk seal side. Treatment is not what we're going to hang our hats on. It's just there's too many holes in this at this point in time that the mitigation strategy for toxoplasmosis and its threat to monk seals is not lying in treatment. And now that we have more seals that have died from toxoplasmosis than seals that have died from fishhook ingestion, we're really concerned. Some solutions. And so that's what I'm going to go into next. We don't have the treatment side of things, but in order to understand what other solutions might be out there, let's go to California. Let's look at some other marine mammals that die and get sick from Toxoplasma infections. And those are these sea otters. So sea otters turn out to be really helpful for scientists that are interested in studying the infections in marine mammals. That is because these otters have a very small home range. So unlike our monk seals that can move and go out to sea for miles and miles and miles, otters have a small home range. They stay and they feed close to shore. So wherever they're getting exposed is somewhere very specific to where they're hanging out. They also bring their prey to the surface, as this otter has a clam at the surface of the water. So they're bringing their prey up, and that means that these scientists that are standing here in this picture on cliffs with a scope and an antenna that's used to track a tagged otter and find its location can identify individual otters, see where they're going, see where they're eating, and bring their prey to the surface to see what they're eating. So all of those variables are controlled for in a lot of ways in this population. So we can learn some stuff from this and apply it to monk seals, which don't lend themselves quite as favorably to this level of investigation. What they've learned is that the otters are exposed via their prey, and what otters eat filter the water. They're filter feeders. So we're talking about clams and mussels, things that are getting microscopic particles out of the water, and they're eating that and filtering them out of the water and then flushing the water out of their systems. So they're actually accumulating the eggs from the environment, and they're just holding on to those. Toxoplasmosis in these otters is actually more common in the otters that live close to areas of high terrestrial runoff of water. So when there's a lot of rainfall, there are these watershed drainage areas. It washes from the mountains to the sea and goes out into the ocean. California also has high seasonality with their rainfall, particularly in the Monterey area and the places where these otters live. So not only are the otters that are hanging out where there's these big outflows of runoff from the land into the sea, it's generally quite seasonal as well. So the dry season, they don't have as many infections. The wet season, they can actually have outbreaks of this disease in these otters. So what does this mean for Hawaiian monk seals? We have a Mauka to Makai problem. We don't have a problem of seals hanging out on beaches where there are cats. We have a problem of cat feces being deposited into the environment anywhere in the islands, from the tops of the mountains down to the beaches. And this is a problem that is causing those oocysts, or those eggs, which are the red dots, to be flushed from way up high or lower down, wherever they happen to be. They're getting washed into the nearshore environment where seals are exposed. So it's plausible to think, and we do have some preliminary information to tell us, that there are more seals that are exposed to Toxoplasma than actually get sick and die. So what is that all about? What makes one seal develop disease when it's exposed, and maybe another seal get exposed and not actually get sick, or maybe get sick later in life? So I'm going to go into this in a little bit of detail, and this is going to be from the standpoint of the Toxoplasma organism. There are some variables related to the seal that can be at play, and there are some variables related to the environment that can be at play. And we don't know all of the answers to this. So this is an area where we can make some educated, informed assumptions. For Toxoplasma, some of them can be thought of as stronger, more pathogenic, more disease-causing than other Toxoplasma. So not all Toxoplasma are created equal. As we said, they're sexually recombining their genetic material in the gut of cats. So that means that some of them may combine to create genetic variants of Toxoplasma that are really bad, nasty bugs. And there might be some that recombine and they're much more mild. If you guys have had seasonal flu shots, you know that every year there's a different type of flu, or 3 different types of flu viruses that are in that vaccine every year. And I'm using a virus example to help illustrate something about a parasite, but just bear with me for a second. If you get the flu, you're getting different types of flu every time you get the flu. You're not always getting the same exact flu virus, but we all still call it the flu. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. There might be some that are really nasty, and there might be some that aren't so much. And it just depends on how they recombined their genetic material and got defecated out by the cat into the environment in that particular infection. So that might be why some seals could be exposed and not have any problems, and other seals might get exposed to other Toxoplasma organisms and have some problems. What else? We have a lot of seals with very individual differences, and they can vary seal to seal. They can vary in one seal over different periods of time, and they can vary over different locations even. So, for example, not everyone in this room likes the same top 3 foods as their favorite foods to eat, right? Same thing with monk seals. They have a very diverse diet. They feed on the ocean bottom most of the time. And there might be some individual to individual differences between seals that may make some seals more likely to get infected with certain prey types and others not so much. It could be a location difference. It could be that there are some seals that preferentially hang out in areas where there might be more eggs getting flushed into the environment, where there might be certain prey that are taking up those eggs from the water column and being more likely to expose the seals in those places. Or other stressors that occur at different times in life. Pregnancy. So it could be that a seal that may get infected while she's pregnant is going to be more likely to have some problems. Or a seal that's molting. Monk seals have something called a catastrophic molt, where they will molt their entire hair coat over a 1 to 2 week period of time. And this happens once a year. And they generally reduce their activity level. They're going out a little bit in the water, but they spend a lot more time on the beach. And it's really energetically taxing to their bodies. So that is a stressor. And it could be that if a seal gets exposed while it's going through one of these normal stressors in its life, that it may be more likely to develop disease. It may be less capable of fighting off that infection. And then the environment varies too. So, for example, I talked a little bit about this watershed drainage in California, what we know with the otters. It may be that there might be certain times of the year where runoff varies, or the degree of runoff from the mountains to the sea changes. And that's another example of how we may have a difference that would make some seals that get exposed more likely to get sick and others less likely to be exposed even in the first place. So all of these factors vary, and they don't vary evenly with each other. One of these may influence whether or not a seal develops disease. So it's definitely a complicated picture, but I'm going to try to go back to the basics and wrap up with what you really need to know. Cats are invasive to Hawaii. So we have seals and cats in an area where seals have not had years and hundreds of years, even thousands to tens of thousands of years, to exist with this parasite. It is a new thing for monk seals. And that's important because we know that these infections in other wildlife on islands, in island ecosystems specifically, for example, Australia, they generally tend to not do so well when they get exposed. So they're more likely to get sick in areas where they haven't had time to what we would say co-evolve. So we're looking at something that is relatively new. Cats contaminate the environment, and they are the only ones that contaminate the environment. All of those other animals that I said that can get infected, they are not shedding the eggs into the environment. So ultimately, cats are the source of all infections. Even if we talk about individual to individual transmission, say from a tissue cyst in a pig into a person, all of those infections still had to originate with eggs that were shed into the environment in the feces of a cat. Cats are the only thing that enable this disease to persist. And one other caveat that I didn't get a chance to mention here. Sometimes people think, oh, well, if you spay and neuter the cats, then the parasite can't reproduce. Not true. Because spaying and neutering the cat prevents the cat from reproducing, which is totally a good thing. But the reproduction of the parasite, remember, that's happening in the stomach tract of the cat. So spaying and neutering cats does not stop egg shedding. Monk seals. More die than are found dead every year. The loss of a female means we didn't just lose that seal, we lost her whole reproductive potential. 8 deaths so far is definitely an underestimate of the population impact, because we know that seals are a bit less likely to show up from this disease, and more often than not, they're dead before we have the opportunity to intervene. They experience pain, and treatment is not the solution. So going back to our life cycle, how do we fix this problem? What do we know, and what have we learned today about the life cycle that can help us understand how we get some solutions? We put our cat in a house, and the cat stays exclusively indoors. If the cat's indoors only, it can't go prey on birds and rodents and things, so it breaks that link. So it's not going to allow that life cycle to be completed, because you've now got a stopgap in that part of the cycle. Furthermore, if the cat stays inside, it's not pooping outside. So it's not spreading eggs into the environment. And if you're left with some birds or rodents or other things that might have some tissue cysts still in their muscle, the most you're going to get is some individual to individual transmission that will eventually die out, because from the parasite's perspective, this is a dead end. So the best way is to keep cats exclusively indoors, and that will prevent seal deaths. Cat poop in the environment equals seal deaths. Cats indoors, seals are happy. Seals are not the only cats or by these infections. So on the screen are pictures of Alala and Nene. These are 2 of Hawaii's native birds that have also died from these infections. And if you add on to that, not related to Toxoplasma infections, but cats that are living outside are also preying on native birds. This is a beneficial thing to do for a lot of reasons. So keeping cats inside. Take-home messages. This is the last slide. Infected non-cat hosts do not shed eggs in their feces. All Toxoplasma infections, even those that kill monk seals, originate in cat feces that are shedding eggs. This problem is Mauka to Makai. It's not an isolated, localized problem. So Hawaii's islands in general, they are all watersheds. They're draining water on all sides of these islands. This is a problem that is archipelago-wide. And it's resolved by keeping cat feces out of the environment. So with that, you guys have asked some really good questions, but if there are any more, I'm very happy to take them. And also here's my email address. So if you want a copy of that paper or you have any other follow-up questions later on, feel free to drop me an email anytime. Yeah, question?
The egg and the cyst. Is it one cyst per egg? Do we have a cyst, or can that cyst break up into little other cysts?
In order to try to explain things better, I tried to simplify that for you guys, but the reality is that an egg can cause a cyst, and that is a slow-moving form. Generally, there's another stage in between there where it actually makes multiple little guys. And so they have different names. So it can go from egg to what's called a tachyzoite, and multiple tachyzoites can go out into different parts of the body. And each one of those little teeny tiny tachyzoites can form a cyst.
You look at the 8 deaths of monk seals, main Hawaiian Islands, the monk seal populations of different countries on many islands. So that's a large percentage.
It is, yep,
More than if you think about 1,000.
correct, correct. Marilyn?
I thought there was a drug they sometimes used in humans, but it was caught up in the news last year because it was the one that company jacked up from something to like $7,000.
Yeah. So that's the difficulty, is because we know that the drugs that could be used are not without side effects. And sometimes the side effects are just as bad. So, and the cost is another factor. But the drug that would be used in people to try to transfer that to seals, again, it kind of goes back to the other question earlier, like we're not really wanting to use an endangered species to test this sort of thing out. And we get desperate, we may be looking for ways to try. So that's where we're going to try, but kind of